1970s was an era of change and activism. Fights for environmentalism, feminism, and equality encompassed American society. However, the cause Americans campaigned for most of all was peace. The Vietnam War, beginning in 1954, engaged the U.S. military in war and the public in protest. One protest in particular completely turned the country upside down as it turned to a major conflict. The 1970 Kent State Massacre, the killing of 4 unarmed college students at the hand of the Ohio National Guard, triggered hundreds of anti-war protests opposing the Vietnam War and President Nixon, and the total transformation of the relationship between law enforcement and protesters in the United States. The Vietnam War pitted the North Vietnamese Communists, or Viet Minh, against the South Vietnamese Republicans. The Viet Minh, assisted by South Vietnamese sympathizers known as the Viet Cong, wanted to unite Vietnam as a singular communist regime. The U.S. backed Southern President Ngo Dinh Diem, beginning with President Dwight Eisenhower in the late 1950s. President John F. Kennedy boosted aid to Diem and established the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam in Saigon, Republic of Vietnam, due to his belief in the domino theory. If one Asian country fell to communism, the rest would soon follow. President Lyndon B. Johnson never formally declared war, but authorized the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing the U.S. to use any measure necessary to prevent further aggression by the North, and enacted a large bombing plan called Operation Rolling Thunder. Almost immediately, an anti-war movement sprung up on college campuses, beginning with the Students for a Democratic Society organization. In 1968, following the Viet Cong Tet Offensive, surprise attacks on South Vietnam designed to have a heavy death toll, a large amount of American troops were requested to be deployed. By then, 50% of Americans disapproved of Johnson's handling of the war, as the U.S. was seemingly losing the battle. Richard Nixon took office in 1969 and promptly initiated his idea of Vietnamization, reduce U.S. involvement in the war and transfer responsibility to South Vietnam. He advocated for the achievement of peace with honor. The U.S. would maintain its position of integrity while simultaneously reaching an end to the war. On April 20, 1970, Nixon announced that all American troops were scheduled to leave Vietnam by 1972, satisfying the nation. Nevertheless, just 8 days later, he secretly called for the invasion of Cambodia, a neutral country, without consulting his cabinet or Congress. Nixon defended his decision to the public in a televised speech on April 30th by declaring that an expansion of the war would put pressure on North Vietnam, eventually bring the communists down altogether.
The actions of the enemy in the last 10 days clearly endanger the lives of Americans who are in Vietnam now and would constitute an unacceptable risk to those who will be there after withdrawal of another 150,000. To protect our men who are in Vietnam and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action.
Nixon's obviously contradicting policies and attack on neutrality struck a nerve with the student body of Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. On May 1st, rallies began on campus during the day around the Commons and ROTC building. Later that night, protesters smashed store windows downtown, showing the first signs of serious conflict and prompting police and riot gear to arrest students and take them back to campus. The mayor of Kent declared civil emergency, and the Ohio National Guard was dispatched, though the situation had already been handled. The next day, students cleaned up after the commotion that had occurred. Around 8 p.m., the ROTC building was set on fire as crowds gathered to watch. The National Guard doused the fire and cleared the area surrounding the building. Ohio Governor James Rhodes referred to the protesting students as the worst type of people that we harbor in America, and vowed to rid the campus of the dissenters. By May 3rd, over 1,000 guardsmen now occupied the college campus. When students blocked traffic on their way to meet with officials, who never showed up, the National Guard used bayonets and tear gas to disperse the protesting students. The following day, May 4th, 1970, a conflict occurred that would unknowingly change the protest movement as a whole. Though demonstrations were banned on the campus, over 3,000 students gathered in the Commons, a concave area surrounded by hills. When guardsmen ordered the students to leave, they were met with chants and thrown rocks. The Guardsmen retaliated with tear gas and bayonets once again. The protesters pushed the National Guard back, forcing them into two separate groups. The larger group retreated onto the fenced-in practice football field. The Guardsmen were moving back up the hill when 28 men turned back, firing 67 shots in 13 seconds. Four students, Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krauss, William Schroeder, and Sandra Schuer, were killed by the bullets and 9 more were wounded. Panic surged through the crowd as they witnessed their classmates and friends gunned down. The Commons were quickly evacuated and Kent State was shut down for 6 weeks, but the protests that followed survived for much longer. The events at Kent State inspired student strikes and demonstrations on college campuses across the country. On May 9th, over 100,000 protesters gathered across the street from the White House to show Nixon their anger over the recent massacre. However, no changes were immediately made, as just 11 days after Kent State, another campus experienced tragedy. At Jackson State College in Mississippi, state police opened fire on the crowd of African American student demonstrators, killing 2 and injuring 12. Public support for the Kent State students and their cause was present throughout the country. Songs like Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young and Student Demonstration Time by the Beach Boys brought even more attention to the incident. Despite the overwhelming support, a different group that Nixon liked to refer to as the silent majority was growing. Those that backed the war in Vietnam believed the rioters brought the deaths upon themselves. Many condescendingly looked upon the students, especially the adults in the town of Kent.
Actually, the first correspondence I opened up after I came out of the induced coma on Friday after the shootings, and it started off with, "Dear Communist Hippie Radical, I hope by the time you read this you are dead."
After the incident, 25 protesters were criminally charged for their actions during the riot. Nixon formed the President's Commission on Campus Unrest to investigate the causes of campus violence and ways to prevent it. The resulting report favored the National Guard, placing much of the blame on the students. The victims and their families finally received reparations 9 years after the massacre. In 1979, a compromise was reached when the state controlling board agreed to pay $675,000 to the 13 victims' families. A formal statement from the state of Ohio, intended to be an apology, was also included in the settlement. The government finally admitted fault for the blood spill on that infamous day, but many believed it was not enough. Public opinion opposing Nixon only grew stronger. Pressure to end the war finally caught up to Nixon in 1973. The U.S. finally pulled out of the Vietnam War on January 27th, formalized by the Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam.
That we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Following the president's resignation in 1974, aid to South Vietnam was reduced. Soon after, the South fell to North Vietnam and the unified country became the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which it remains to this day. Most importantly, the Kent State Massacre completely changed the face of protests in America. Even peaceful protests were viewed as radical and dangerous. A new relationship centered on hostility on both sides developed between protesters and law enforcement. Though the right to assemble and protest is an inherent value in American society, the criminalization of demonstrators continues. The Ferguson, Missouri riots, where Black Lives Matter groups gathered to protest the death of Michael Brown, eerily reflected the Kent State protests as police dressed in riot gear flooded the city on armored trucks. The tragic events that transpired at Kent State University on May 4, 1970, became the spark of a massive nationwide strike and protest movement against the U.S. government and involvement in the Vietnam War. The Ohio National Guard's bloody hands and the death of 4 college students dramatically altered the perception of law enforcement in the eyes of protesters and youth. The tensions between demonstrators and military and police has persisted among generations since the Kent State incident. Despite the negative connotations of protest, the fight for peace and justice rages on as American society remains abundant with youth activists protesting for change, due to the path paved by the brave students of Kent State University almost 50 years ago.